Tip of the sun rays, everyone. Tip of the sun rays. I would like to say blessed day to everyone. We're going to try something new today, and we're going to watch some fish while we read. Yeah, and this is live in the Pacific. It's an aquarium of the Pacific, so this is what we're watching right now. But I want to tell y'all, we do this for entertainment purposes only. I do this because I want to. You do this because you want to. Just to let you know, so then that way everybody understands why we do this. It's because it's your choice. And with that being, I want everybody to take your left hand, place it up, right palm down. Dear Heavenly Father, I ask that you will go ahead and give us the ability to understand and bless everyone this morning as they've been able to wake up one more day to put one more shot out there in the world to get to where they really want to be at. Lord, I ask that you give everyone the ability to just not only seek out their own knowledge, but to find it in their heart to touch someone else and give them the information so that they can touch one more soul and place them in your hands, in your ever-loving protection. With that being, one heart, one soul, one mind, one goal. Amen, amen, amen. All right, everybody. So today, what we're going to be reading on is chapter 5, Eradicating Public Debt. Just to let you guys know also, this is not my book. These are not my writings. This is not my verbiage. This is the verbiage from the book of the 0% for those that do not know. So what we're going to do is go ahead and start out with chapter 5, Eradicating Public Debt. A lot of people always wonder, so how do you get rid of debt? How do you get rid of it? What will we do to change the system? That's the question that people come up with every day when they start running through this process. How are we going to change the system that is broken in front of us if we see that it is broken? Well, here's your answer right here. For everybody that got that question stuck in their head, here we go. Let's get it started. Chapter 5, Eradicating Public Debt. Most would argue whether or not there is lawful money circulating in today's economic system. In 1933, the United States Corporation asked the people to turn in all of their gold and silver and give it to the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 states, to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. And Section 10, Clause 1 reads, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender and payment of debts. The Treasury, permitted by the Constitution, is only allowed to issue precious metals in gold and silver coins as tender of payment. In the year 2021, gold and silver coins are not issued by banks or traded in any market as a form of payment for services, but instead, the United States circulates Federal Reserve notes, better known as cash or fiat paper. All fiat paper printed from 1933 and beyond has the specific language stating, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. It would make sense that due to the confiscation of all gold and silver in circulating fiat currency, the Treasury has all lawful money. For the people to have this lawful money, the people must use the Treasury to get it. Lawful money cancels out public debt, created by interest applied to negotiable instruments. Gold and silver is fixed weight of value and therefore not negotiable, such as Federal Reserve notes. There are two sides of the dollar bill, a public and private side to the Federal Reserve note. Before 1933, all paper bills displayed a different language than all 1933 and beyond paper bills. Within any search engine, there are images of lawful money of the United States. There are bills in the images such as a $5 bill issued in 1928, which says redeemable in gold demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. This wording comes from Title 12, Banks and Banking, Chapter 3, Federal Reserve System, Subchapter 12, Federal Reserve Notes, Section 411. In July of 1933, the Columbus Dental Manufacturing Company submitted an application to the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland in the amount of $10,000 or $10 grand worth of precious metals. The bank approved the application in just one day of submitting the application, acquiring 476.92 ounces of gold and valued at $9,867.14. In the depths of the Great Depression, anyone would question why was the Cleveland Fed supplying gold to an unsuccessful firm rather than supplying gold coins and gold-backed currency to banks. Does the Federal Reserve supply gold to any business today? The answer to these questions revolves around President Roosevelt's gold program, which began in 1933. It first restricted the private use of gold, requiring businesses like Columbus to apply to the Fed for precious metals. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 was signed by President Roosevelt in January of 1934, which transferred ownership of all precious metals in the United States to the Treasury, according to Section 2 of the Act. Monetary gold included all coins and bullion held by individuals and institutions, including the Federal Reserve. In return, the individuals and institutions received currency at a rate of $35 per ounce of gold. This rate reduced the gold value of the dollar to 59% of the value set by the Gold Act of 1900, which equaled $20.67 per ounce. That rate had prevailed until the spring of 1933, when the Roosevelt administration began its campaign to devalue the dollar. The Glass-Steagall Act effectively separated commercial banks from the process of investing banking and creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. Among other public programs, it was one of the most debated legislative initiatives that President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed into law in June 1933. According to the Federal Reserve history. In the wake of 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression, Congress was concerned that commercial banking operations and the payment system were incurring losses from highly volatile equity markets. An important motivation for the act was the desire to restrict the use of bank credit for speculation and direct bank credit into what Glass and others thought to be more productive uses, such as industry, commerce, and agriculture. In response to these concerns, the main provisions of the Banking Act of 1933 effectively separated commercial banking from investment banking. Senator Glass was the driving force behind this provision. Commercial banks, which took in deposits and made loans, were no longer allowed to underwrite or deal in securities, while investment banks, which underwrote and managed securities, were no longer allowed to have close connections to commercial banks, such as overlapping directorships or common ownerships. Another relevant provision of the Act created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures bank deposits with a pool of money collected from banks. This provision was the most controversial at the time and drew veto threats from President Roosevelt. It was included at Siegel's insistence, who had the interest of small rural banks in mind. Small rural banks and their representatives were the leading proponents of deposit insurance. Opposition came from large banks that believed they would end up subsidizing small banks. Past attempts by states to install deposit insurance have been unsuccessful because of moral hazard and because local banks were not diversified. After the bank holiday, the public showed vast support for insurance, partly hoping to recover some of the losses and partly because many blamed Wall Street and big bankers for the Depression. Although Glass had opposed deposit insurance for years, he changed his mind and urged Roosevelt to accept it. A temporary fund became effective in January 1934, insuring deposits up to $2,500. The fund became permanent in July 1934, and the limit was raised to $5,000. This limit was raised numerous times over the years until reaching the current $250,000. All Federal Reserve Banks, member banks on or before July 1, 1934 were required to become stockholders of the FDIC. No state bank was eligible for membership in the Federal Reserve System until it became a stockholder of the FDIC and became an insured institution, with required membership by national banks and voluntary membership by state banks. Deposit insurance is still viewed as a great success. Although the problem of moral hazard and adverse selection came up again during the banking failures of the 1980s, in response, Congress passed legislation that strengthened capital requirements and required banks with less capital to close. Today's fiat paper currency says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. How exactly does an American obtain a public debt or a private debt? To understand these questions, a couple of definitions that govern the United States dollar are essential and can provide America's remedy for eradicating the national public debt. Title 12 U.S.C. Code 411 states, Federal Reserve notes to be issued at the discretion of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System for the purpose of making advances to Federal Reserve banks through the Federal Reserve agents as hereunto set forth, and for no other purpose are authorized. The said notes shall be obligations of the United States and shall be receivable by all national and member banks and Federal Reserve banks, and for all taxes, customs, and other public dues. They shall be redeemed in lawful money on demand at the Treasury Department of the United States or at any Federal Reserve bank. Title 12 informs everyone who uses Federal Reserve notes that they are obligations of the United States. If Federal Reserve notes are obligations of the United States, shouldn't the Reserve or the U.S. Treasury and its representatives be responsible for the taxes? Customs and public dues. Public debt originates from negotiable instruments, and private debts are associated with non-negotiable instruments or contracts involving entities not associated with the Federal Reserve, such as a private investor. The Uniform Commercial Code defines a negotiable instrument as, ears should perk up, 2, paragraph A, except as provided in sections C and D, negotiable instrument means an unconditional promise or order to pay a fixed amount of money with or without interest or other charges described in the promise or order. When observing any denomination of a Federal Reserve note, it displays a fixed amount of money, and interest can be applied to the fixed amount or not. Paragraph 1 is payable to bearer or to order at the time it is issued or first comes into possession of a holder. Anyone who possesses any denomination of Federal Reserve note can exchange the note as soon as it is in the holder's hands. Paragraph 2 is payable on demand or at a definite time, and anyone who possesses any denomination of a Federal Reserve note can exchange the note as soon as it is in the holder's hands or any time in the future. Paragraph 3 does not state any other undertaking or instructions by the person promising or ordering payment to do any act in addition to the payment of money, but the promise or order may contain, paragraph I, subparagraph I, an undertaking or power to give, maintain, or protect collateral to secure payment, an authorization or power to the holder to confess judgment or realize on or dispose of collateral, or, subparagraph 3, a waiver of the benefit of any law intended for the advantage or protection of an obliger. The latter explained that any negotiable instrument, fiat paper bill, aka Federal Reserve notes, has no restrictions. Still, it obligates the exchanger, and the exchanger has no other protections of the law. If a negotiable instrument refers to the public side of the dollar bill, it would remain that a non-negotiable instrument is in reference to the dollar bill's private side. Subparagraph B, instrument means a negotiable instrument. Subparagraph C, an order that meets all of the requirements of subsection A except paragraph 1 and otherwise falls within the definition of check in subsection F if a negotiable instrument and a check. Subparagraph D, a promise or order other than a check is not an instrument if, at the time it is issued or first comes into possession of a holder, it contains a conspicuous statement, however, expressed to the effect that the promise or order is not negotiable or is not an instrument governed by this article. All bills before 1933 contained a conspicuous statement stating redeemed in lawful money on demand at the U.S. Treasury or any Federal Reserve Bank. Therefore, they are not negotiable. This is the key to reducing the national debt, public debt. We'll repeat that again. This is the key to reducing the national public debt. Non-negotiable instruments, demand notes, must be exchanged in every commercial transaction to discharge public debt created by negotiable instruments. Subparagraph E, an instrument is a note if it is a promise and it is a draft, if it is an order. If an instrument falls within the definition of both note and draft, a person entitled to enforce the instrument may treat it as either. Subsection F, check means. Subsection I, a draft or other than a documentary draft payable on demand and drawn on a bank, or subsection 2, a chaser's check or teller's check. An instrument may be a check even though it is described on its face by another term such as money order. Subsection G, cashier's check means a draft with respect to which the drawer and drawee are the same bank or branches of the same bank. Take, for example, an American writing a check to the Internal Revenue Service for a payment towards a tax bill. The check would be considered a cashier's check because the IRS is the public side to the U.S. Treasury private sector. They are both the same bank on which the same account is drawn or deposited. Paragraph H, teller's check means a draft drawn by a bank on another bank, or subsection 2, payable at or through a bank. Paragraph I, traveler's check means an instrument that 1, is payable on demand, 2, is drawn on or payable at or through a bank, 3, is designated by the term traveler's check or by a substantial similar term, and 4, requires as a condition to payment a counter signature by a person whose specimen signature appears on the instrument. Paragraph J, certificate of deposit means an instrument containing an acknowledgement by a bank that a sum of money has been received by the bank and a promise by the bank to repay the sum of money. A certificate of deposit is a note of the bank. UCC 3-104, negotiable instrument. Take a look at any birth certificate issued from Vital Statistics or any public health department that warehouses birth certificate receipts. It will state a banknote at the bottom of the certificate with a series of numbers. The birth certificate is a certificate of deposit within the U.S. stock market on behalf of international bankers and creditors for the United States. Again, this pertains to U.S. citizens being listed as human capital on the NASDAQ, according to the Senator James Triplicant Jr. of Ohio on March 17, 1933, addressing the House. Mr. Speaker, we are here now in Chapter 11. Members of Congress are official trustees presiding over the greatest reorganization of any bankrupt entity in world history. The U.S. government, we are setting forth, hopefully, a blueprint for our future. There are some who say it is a coroner's report that will lead to our demise. United States Congressional Record, March 17, 1993, Volume 33, page H-1303. It is an established fact that the United States federal government has been dissolved by the Emergency Banking Act, March 9, 1933. 48 Stat 1, Public Law 89 through 719. Declared by President Roosevelt, being bankrupt and insolvent. The receivers of the United States bankruptcy are the international bankers, the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. All United States offices, officials, and departments are now operating within a de facto status in name only, under emergency war powers. This democratic form of government is an established socialist communist order under a new government for America. This act was instituted by transferring and or placing the office of the Secretary of Treasury to that of the Governor of the International Monetary Fund. Public Law 94-564, page 8, section HR 13955 reads in part, The United States Secretary of Treasury receives no compensation for representing the United States. The Federal Reserve describes what lawful money is and how it is applied to specific case law on its website. It reads, Lawful money is a term used in the Federal Reserve Act, the act that authorizes the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System to issue Federal Reserve notes. The act states that Federal Reserve notes shall be obligations of the United States and shall be receivable by all national and member banks and Federal Reserve banks and for all taxes, customs, and other public dues. They shall be redeemed in lawful money on demand as the Treasury Department of the United States in the City of Washington, District of Columbia, or at any Federal Reserve Bank. The act did not, however, define the term lawful money, but up until 1913, the only currency issued by the United States that was legally recognized as lawful money was various issues of demand notes, subsequently known as old demand notes, and United States notes, authorized by Congress during the Civil War. At the time, some currency was not considered legal tender, although it could be used by national banking associations as lawful money reserves. Thus, the term lawful money had a broader meaning than the term legal tender. In 1933, Congress changed the law so that all U.S. coins and currency, including Federal Reserve notes, regardless of when issued, constitutes legal tender for all purposes. Federal and state courts since then have repeatedly held that Federal Reserve notes are also lawful money. Milliam versus U.S. 524 F 2D 629 Ninth Circuit Court 1974 is a typical of the federal and state court cases holding that Federal Reserve notes are lawful money, and reviewed a judgment denying relief to an individual who sought to redeem a $50 Federal Reserve banknote in lawful money. The United States tendered Milliam $50 in Federal Reserve notes, but Milliam refused the notes, asserting that lawful money must be gold or silver. The Ninth Circuit, noting that this matter had been put to rest by the U.S. Supreme Court nearly a century before in the legal tender cases. Juilliard versus Greenman, 110 U.S. 420, 1884, rejected this assertion as frivolous and affirmed the judgment. What is lawful money? How is it different from legal tender? http://federalreserve.gov. Taking a closer look at the Milliam case, the Federal Reserve Bank is using to determine what is lawful money and what is not. The Mobley M. Milliam Appellant versus United States of America, et al. Appeals 524 F2D 629 9th Circuit 1974 is a memorandum before Kilkenny and Trask, Circuit Judges, and Craig, District Judge. Appellant has filed a substantial brief and an adequate reply briefly and has argued his full share of allowed time insupportable for a demand that his $50 Federal Reserve banknote be redeemed in lawful money of the United States, which he says in effect must be silver or gold. Appellant refused appellee's tender of an equivalent value in Federal Reserve notes. Appellant's contentions, in our view, were put to rest close to a century ago in Juilliard versus Greenman, 110 U.S. 420, 448, 4 Section CTI, 122, 130, 28 L. Ed. 204, 1884, in which it is said, under the law, to borrow money on the credit of the United States and to issue circulating notes for the money borrowed, its power to define the quality and force of those notes as currency is as broad as the like power over a metallic currency under the power to coin money and to regulate the value thereof. Under the two powers taken together, Congress is authorized to establish a national currency, either in coin or in paper, and to make that currency lawful money for all purposes, as regards the national government or private individuals. While we agree that golden eagles, double eagles, and silver dollars were lovely to look at and delightful to hold, we must at the same time recognize that time marches on, and that even the time-honored silver dollar is no longer available in its last bastion of defense. The brilliant casinos of the houses of chance in the state of Nevada, appellant is entitled to redeem his note, but not in precious metal. Simply stated, we find his contentions frivolous. Judgment affirmed. The appellant did not realize that the Federal Reserve note has two sides. The Supreme Court informed the appellant that the that the Constitution is the contract that allows them to determine what is lawful money and what is not. According to contract law and the terms of the law, both cases mention the Federal Reserve has determined that Federal Reserve notes are lawful money and equal to that of gold and silver, as long as they are used as treasury notes on the private side. Depending on the user's knowledge and understanding of the Federal Reserve note, it will determine its tender of payment. Whether it is a negotiable instrument on the public side with interest or a non-negotiable demand note on the private side without interest. The dollar bill has two sides. The public side is a Federal Reserve note, and the private side is a U.S. Treasury demand note. Upon looking at a dollar bill, it may not be noticeable how contract law applies in this manner. The words Federal Reserve note is located at the top of the bill in a black box, referring to the four corner rules. In contract law, the four corner rule simply stipulates that if two parties enter into a written agreement, they cannot use oral or implied agreements in court to contradict the terms of the written agreement. It is the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury who are the two parties entering into an agreement, which removes their responsibilities or liabilities for the instrument, transferring its liability to whoever uses the instrument as a negotiable instrument. There are two signatures on every denomination of a Federal Reserve note, one for the Treasurer of the United States and the other for the Secretary of Treasury. Keep in mind, Secretary of Treasury is now the governor for the International Monetary Fund, which is the public side to the actual U.S. Treasury. Therefore, the Treasurer of the United States is the actual Treasurer of the private side. Reducing the public debt is obtainable by steering away from Federal Reserve notes as the beginning and end to Americans' daily commerce. The issuer must reserve their rights upon their signature when using lawful money. Although a Federal Reserve note is already signed by the Treasurer of the U.S. and the Secretary of Treasury, Governor of IMF, Americans are not supposed to reserve their rights on the actual Federal Reserve note, but instead on their own demand notes, checks, or whenever using credit cards. Simply exchange Federal Reserve notes for United States postal money orders or checks issued by any Federal Reserve bank such as Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, etc., and add the conspicuous statement of Title 12 USC 411 that was once provided on all United States denominational bills before 1933 in the memo section. The imperative language is redeemed in lawful money or on demand at the U.S. Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank, and provides a signature followed by the words, all rights reserved. This is called a restricted endorsement, which means the obligation from the public and puts the obligation back onto the United States corporation to reduce the national debt lawfully. The UCC informs everyone that unless the conspicuous statement and or rights are reserved, the person using the instrument is held responsible. If a person acting or purporting to act as a representative signs an instrument by signing either the name of the represented person or the name of the signer, the represented person is bound by the signature to the same extent the represented person would be bound if the signature were on a simple contract. If the represented person is bound, the signature of the representative is the authorized signature of the represented person, and the represented person is liable on the instrument, whether or not identified in the instrument. If a representative signs the name of the representative to an instrument and the signature is an authorized signature of the represented person, the following rules apply. 1. If the form of the signature shows unambiguously that the signature is made on behalf of the represented person who is identified in the instrument, the representative is not liable on the instrument. UCC 3-402, signature by representative. When the Treasurer of the United States and the Secretary of Treasury sign a negotiable instrument, i.e. dollar bill, which is a contract, without restricting their rights, they become responsible for the debt attached to the dollar bill. This is why Title 12 USC 411 states that all forms of money are the United States obligations. Since many Americans are using negotiable instruments, dollar bills, without restricting their rights, restricted endorsement, on their demand notes such as money orders or checks, Americans become responsible for the national public debt. Through the 14th Amendment, fictitious in legis as one of the entities called the States United. This is how the government is off the hook from all liability and can tax the U.S. citizen and their children to pay down extreme amounts of debt. All checks linked to any checking account at any bank will have a section for the issuer to sign their name on the provided line. What's interesting is that the line is not a line at all. If zoomed in closely, the words authorized representative can be seen, followed by the letters MP, meaning microprint. Anyone who signs their name without restricting their rights becomes responsible for the negotiable instrument that are created. The national public debt is not entirely the federal government's fault. Unfortunately, it is the fault of the American people. Americans have been given the choice from the federal government to use any Federal Reserve note as a negotiable instrument or a non-negotiable demand note. There is no budget plan discussed in political campaigns that will magically reduce the national debt. The national debt in North America has increased more than 21% since President Trump took office in January of 2017. With the debt to gross domestic product, GDP, ratio approaching 110% in 2019 under President Obama's administration, the national debt increased 100% from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. As of April 13th, 2020, the U.S. government debt is up to $24.22 trillion. It is codified within Title 31, Money and Finance subsection 3101, that the public debt is limited. The face amount of obligations issued and the face amount of obligations whose principals and interest are guaranteed by the United States government may not be more than $14,294,000,000. That is $9,926,000,000 over the legal Americans, over the public debt limitations. It is easy to understand why so many Americans, beyond politicians and economists, are starting to pay close attention to this issue. Unfortunately, how the debt level is explained to the public is usually glossed over. Pair this problem with the fact that many individuals do not understand how the national debt level affects them on a daily basis, including their future generations. Regarding banking, most Americans are misinformed of the workings of the Federal Reserve System or how money is circulated in the United States economy. It all starts with politicians requesting then the opposition. Requesting to be put into office, promising to provide more free benefits to the public than the opposition. The main issue the politician faces is the need for more money to provide the promised free stuff. However, the state spends more than its income, which is called deficit spending. To pay for the deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. A bond is a fixed income instrument that represents a loan made by an investor to a borrower. It could be thought of as an IOU between the lender and the borrower that includes the details of the loan and its payments. Treasury bonds are indeed the national public debt, stealing prosperity from the future for spending today, to be paid in the form of taxes. The American people could put an end to it by merely using non-negotiable instruments. Once the bond is created, the Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks compete to buy a large part of the national debt and make a profit by earning interest. After the auction, the banks enter an open market operation to sell the bonds to the Federal Reserve for their profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve begins to write a check on an account with nothing in it, according to the Boston Federal Reserve Bank. When people write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. The Federal Reserve then delivers the bad checks to the banks, and at this point, currency comes into existence. The big banks then use that currency to buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. What is a check? A check is surprisingly an IOU for cash, requiring the receiver to go to the bank and pick it up. In all actuality, the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve exchange IOUs, enriching the banks as middlemen and indebting the people. This is the origination of all of the paper fiat currency. The Treasury then deposits the newly created currency to several government branches, and the government then proceeds to deficit spending, which is directed to public works, social services, and wars. The employees of government hospitals, local school districts, and others then deposit their paychecks into local commercial banks or institutions. This is where things get interesting. When an employee deposits their earnings from labor, they are not depositing into an account to be safely held in trust. Instead, the employee is loaning the bank their earnings, and within certain legal limits, the bank can do anything with it to their benefit. This includes purchasing shares in the stock market or the foreign exchange market and loaning them to the public without giving the employee their fair share of profit. Instead, should the employee choose to keep their earnings in a savings account, the bank sees fit only to give 0.01% to 1% interest back to the employee while the bank made a fortune. At this point, the Federal Reserve System's primary operation comes into play once the employee deposits their earnings. A process called fractional reserve banking is the primary function of all banks in America. It is a system in which only a fraction of bank deposits are backed by actual cash on hand and available for withdrawal. This happens to expand the economy by freeing capital for lending theoretically. Loan ratios vary from institution to institution, using the target incorporated employee, Christopher Alexander Wellington, from the previous chapter as an example to show how earnings affect the economy from a 10% reserve ratio. Now, suppose Mr. Wellington received a separate bonus check from Target for $100 to be deposited into Citibank. In A, the bank can legally take $90 and loan it out to the public without informing Mr. Wellington. Citibank must hold $10 of his deposit in a reserve account in case Mr. Wellington wants to come back and make a withdrawal. Of course, his withdrawal of the entire $100 comes from a pool of other 10% reserves from other people. These reserves are called vault cash. How exactly does Mr. Wellington's bank account statement remain a total of $100 as an available balance? Because the bank created a $100 IOU as bank credit in its place, according to the Federal Reserve of New York. Commercial banks create checkbook money whenever they grant a loan, only by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I bet you thought. Page 19. Under this example, Mr. Wellington's deposit of $100 allows Citibank to create an additional 10% bank credit of $90, and therefore there is $190 in existence. People take out loans from the bank to buy a house, a car, having operating money for a business plan, or consolidating debt. A borrower who wishes to buy a car then takes out a loan of $90 from the same bank that was created as bank credit from Mr. Wellington's account and pays the seller for the car. Then the seller deposits the $90 into their Wells Fargo account, and their bank then loans out 90% of that deposit, creating another set of bank credits, which would be $81, for a total of $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats up to $1,000 bank credit, all backed by just $100 of vault cash. As mentioned before, some reserve ratios are 10%, 3%, and some are 0%. This is where the vast majority of the currency supply in America comes from. In fact, 92% to 96% of all currency in existence is created not by the government, but within banks. The result of this currency expansion by the banks is far higher than this example. This tremendous expansion of currency causes the everyday prices of goods and services to act as a sponge on this never-ending expanding supply. The more currency circulating in existence, the more prices rise to use all of the currency equally. This is where inflation is derived. Rising prices are nearly a symptom. Sadly, this is the entire makeup of America's currency supply. The U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve exchange IOUs, printing 4% to 8% of the money into existence, and the other 92 to 96% is nothing but numbers typed into a computer by the banks as a bank credit. Unfortunately, the American people work for their currency, for that currency supply, trading moments of their lives, hour by hour, day by day, year by year, in exchange for numbers someone printed on pieces of paper or typed into a computer. In the United States, neither paper currency nor deposits have value as commodities. Intrinsically, a dollar bill is just a piece of paper. Deposits merely book entries. Coins do have some intrinsic value as metal, but generally far less than their face value. What then makes these instruments, checks, paper money, and coins acceptable at face value in payment of all debts and for other monetary uses? Mainly, it is the confidence people have that they will be able to exchange such money for other financial assets and for real goods and services when they choose to do so. Modern Money Mechanics, a workbook on bank reserves and deposit expansion, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. The numbers printed or typed now represent Americans' blood, sweat, tears, labor, ideas, and talents so that they can save some of those numbers and pay the tax collector, known as the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS then delivers the taxes over to the U.S. Treasury so that the Treasury can pay the principal and interest on the bonds that the Federal Reserve bought with the check, drawn on an account with nothing in it. Much of taxes collected are not used for schools, public roads, and services, but to pay interest on bonds that the Federal Reserve bought with the check drawn on an account with nothing in it. Is the Federal Reserve committing fraud on the American people, or are the American people unknowingly allowing the Federal Reserve to play their game? Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, there was no need for principal income tax. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and in that very same year, the Constitution was amended to allow income tax stemming from Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. How many hours and dollars were siphoned away from Americans and into the hands of the owners of the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve Bank is not a federal entity at all. It is a stockholder. A stockholder is a share of stock representing a percentage of ownership in a corporation. Therefore, the stockholders are the owners of the corporation. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation with owners according to their website, which says, Appendix B, Dividends. B.1, Payment of dividends from surplus. After all necessary expenses of a Federal Reserve Bank have been paid or provided for, the stockholder shall be entitled to receive an annual dividend of 6% on the paid-in capital stock, which dividend shall be cumulative. Federal Reserve Act, Section 7, Division of Earnings. The American people know all too well that whenever the issue of reducing the national debt or talk of the debt ceiling, the federal government always prints more money and raises taxes to settle the enormous debt. Here's why talk of the debt ceiling is delusional. If the federal government prints the very first dollar into existence, and that is the only dollar that exists, but the government promises to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, the answer is that the government will have to borrow the second dollar into existence and promise to pay it back with interest. Now there are $2 that exist, but $4 is owed, and so on, leading to never enough currency to pay the debt. At last, not with this method. The only way to stop increasing the national public debt created by negotiable instruments is by issuing lawful private money, also known as non-negotiable instruments. But to reduce the current national debt is entirely different. Title 31, Money and Finance. The U.S. Treasury informs that American people, Section A, to provide the people of the United States with an opportunity to make gifts to the United States to be used to reduce the public debt. Section 1, the Secretary of the Treasury may accept for the government a gift of, subparagraph A, money made only on the condition that it is used to reduce the public debt. Subparagraph B, an obligation of the government included in the public debt made only on the condition that the obligation be canceled and retired and not reissued. Title 31 U.S.C. 3113, Accepting Gifts. To discharge the public debt, such as student loans, bank loans, mortgages, etc., the Secretary of Treasury has informed the public of how to successfully aid the government in debt reduction. Non-negotiable demand notes cancel out negotiable instruments by providing the words of Title 12 USC 411. There must also include the words of Section A of Title 31 USC 3113 on the American People's Demand Notes. For example, suppose the target employee Christopher Alexander Wellington has an auto loan for $16,500 and a monthly payment of $378.47 with Ford Motor Creditor. Mr. Wellington has had his loan for 3 years. Now it has decided to cancel the obligation of interest affecting the overall national economic health. The first thing Mr. Wellington must do is understand the laws of making conspicuous statements on negotiable instruments. This rule comes from Uniform Commercial Code known as according and satisfaction by use of instrument. Paragraph B, unless subsection paragraph C applies, the claim is discharged if the person against whom the claim is asserted proves that the instrument or an accompanying written communication contained a conspicuous statement to the effect that the instrument was tendered as full satisfaction of the claim. USC 3-311, subparagraph B. Each state has encoded this UCC rule into its state code, being that Mr. Wellington is a California national. The state code for according to satisfaction is CA-CIV code, chapter 4, section 1526. Where a claim is disputed or unliquidated and a check or draft is tendered by the debtor in settlement thereof in full discharge of the claim, and the words payment in full or other words of similar meaning are noted on the check or draft. The acceptance of the check or draft does not constitute an accord in satisfaction if the creditor protests against accepting the tender in full payment by striking out or otherwise deleting that notation, or if the acceptance of the check or draft was inadvertent or without knowledge of the notation. B, notwithstanding subdivision A, the acceptance of a check or draft constitutes an accord in satisfaction if a check or draft is tendered pursuant to a composition or extension agreement between a debtor and its creditors, and pursuant to that composition of the extension agreement. All creditors of the same class are accorded similar treatment, and the creditor receives the check or draft with knowledge of the restriction. A creditor shall be conclusively presumed to have knowledge of the restriction if a creditor either 1. has previous to the receipt of the check or draft executed a written consent to the composition or extension agreement, 2. has been given not less than 15 days nor more than 90 days prior to receipt of the check or draft notice in writing that a check or draft will be tendered with a restrictive endorsement, and that acceptance in cash of the check or draft will constitute an accord in satisfaction. Subsection C, notwithstanding subsection A, the acceptance of a check or draft by a creditor constitutes an accord in satisfaction when the check or draft is issued pursuant to or in conjunction with the release of a claim. Subsection D, for the purposes of paragraph 2 of subdivision B, mailing the notice by first-class mail, postage prepaid, addressed to the address shown for the creditor on the debtor's books, or such other address as the creditor may designate in writing constitutes notice. According to the law mentioned above, Mr. Wellington first needs to provide the Ford Motor Company a certified mail notice with an attached proof of service, made attention to the Chief Executive Officer. The notice should inform their office will receive a check or draft with the restrictive endorsement, not less than 15 days or not more than 90 days from the date of receipt of this notice. Once 15 days have passed and Mr. Wellington has received a returned certified mail receipt with either no response from Ford Motor Credit Company or a positive confirmation, he may begin to provide him non-negotiable demand note with a restrictive endorsement. Mr. Wellington should use a United States postal money order because of the post office's contractual relationship with the United States Treasury via the Postmaster General. The post office is the closest form of lawful money from the U.S. Treasury that Americans have available. Per Title 39 of the United States Code Book, all officers and employees are constitutional officers. Before entering upon their duties and before receiving any salary, all officers and employees of the Postal Service shall take and subscribe the following oath or affirmation. I, name, do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservations or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. Title 39 USC 1011, Oath of Office, Public L 91-375, August 12, 1970, 84 Stat 733. Title 39 USC 2006, the relationship between the Treasury and the Postal Service reads, Section C, notwithstanding Section 205, subsection D, 5, or 2011, subsection E, 4E, as this title, obligations issued by the Postal Service shall be obligations of the government of the United States, and payment of principal and interest thereon shall be fully guaranteed by the government of the United States, such guarantee being expressed on the face thereof, if and to the extent that Section 1. The Postal Service requests the Secretary of Treasury to pledge the full faith and credit of the government of the United States for the payment of principal and interest thereon, and Paragraph 2. The Secretary, in his discretion, determines that it would be in the public interest to do so. Mr. Wellington has purchased the United States Postal Money Order in the amount equal to his monthly car payment of $378.47. The pay to the order would state Ford Motor Credit Company with its address right below the company name. The memo section is the most crucial, converting the pre-made negotiable instrument to a non-negotiable demand note. The memo should have the following exact language. Payment in full for the reduction of public debt, account number 12345678990, i.e., car loan account number, redeemed in lawful money on demand at the U.S. Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. Mr. Wellington would then provide his name followed by the words, all rights reserved, and provides his address right below. The next step is to properly register the demand note as an extension to Mr. Wellington's UCC-1 financing statement. As explained in Chapter 3, Existence of Life, the extension of the Uniform Commercial Code is the Form UCC-3, Financing Statement Amendment. Mr. Wellington will provide the initial UCC-1 financing statement file number from the Secretary of State's office in Box 1A. Box 3, the option for continuation, will be checked. Any secured party or record would be checked in Box 5. As this continuing statement affects the express trust in Box 8, the third option will be checked as given an entire restated collateral description. Mr. Wellington would provide the full automobile details, the full Ford Motor Credit Company account details, including contract sales date, and a full description of demand note. The Heinz Wolfgang Express Trust would be provided in Box 9A for the secure party option organization name. The UCC-3 must be directed to the Secretary of State for recording. A certified copy of both the UCC-1 and 3 should be obtained from the Secretary of State. And Mr. Wellington is now prepared to delegate discharge instructions to the United States Postmaster General. Both UCC forms with the actual USPS money order and a certified copy of the Declaration of the Express Trust, further explained in the upcoming chapters, and lastly, an introductory trustee letter made attention to the Postmaster General, which the IRS Form W-8 bin would complete Mr. Wellington's accord and satisfaction discharge packet. The W-8 bin will further be explained as well. The introductory letter should provide brief detail introducing the Foreign Express Trust as well as advising the Postmaster General to register the demand note as a Treasury note with the Secretary of U.S. Treasury Department and forward the demand note to Ford Motor Credit Company in respect to Title 31 U.S.C. 3113, accepting gifts. The Chief Executive Officer of the Board of Governors of the United States Postal Service can receive the packet at 475 El Enfant Plaza, Southwest, Washington, D.C. That's it. Once Mr. Wellington sends the payment to the Ford Motor Credit Company and they have cashed the money order, his $16,500 obligation of the United States has just been canceled, reducing the national debt minus $16,500, and would then receive a 1099-C from the lender. The Heinz Wolfgang Express Trust must settle the amount reported in the 1099-C by using the same method or by sending an explanatory statement to the IRS stating that the entity is not required to file nor pay taxes. The IRS will definitely need the trust to cancel the amount provided in the informational 1099-C to clear their books, or else it will be considered as an income to Mr. Wellington's Social Security account. A mortgage or credit card payment would operate just the same. In the event that one is in the middle of purchasing an automobile using an installment sales contract or at the closing table regarding retail estate, a restrictive endorsement is still required to help reduce their national public debt. All installment sales, contracts, and mortgages, promissory notes, or obligations of the United States just waiting to be circulated from one party to another as a negotiable instrument, adding the language redeemed in lawful money on demand at the U.S. Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank, with the signature followed by the words, all rights reserved, will most assuredly prevent a negotiable instrument. If all Americans proceed to issue demand notes in all areas of commercial transactions with the intent to discharge the public debt to stop assuming liability for the use of Federal Reserve notes, the national debt could be eradicated in no time at all. The Federal Reserve note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. All paper fiat currency bills have two sides. A public side from the use of negotiable instruments requires interest, and the private side from the use of a non-negotiable instrument that have no interest but act as lawful money and or treasury notes. Besides, the United States Postal Service offering Americans the best access to the United States Treasury, there is also a United States coin. The majority are led to believe that the Federal Reserve has all the power to create money when indeed all the power they have is to print Federal Reserve notes, but never to coin money. Minting coin has always been the responsibility of the United States Treasury per the Constitution. Despite the smallest amount of silver, gold, and copper in the current U.S. coin, it will always hold more value than a Federal Reserve note. An article entitled Contracts Payable in Gold by George Cyrus Thorpe, showing the legal effect of agreements to pay in gold, Senate Resolutions number 62, April 17, 1933, quotes, "The laws of the United States recognize two kinds of money, namely coin and paper. The term dollars in specie means gold or silver coined dollars. Dollars in currency means dollars in notes or any paper money current in the community." Treblecock versus Wilson, 1872, 12 Wall, 687, 20 LED 460. As of today, the current median income is $34,466 in North America, which is $2,872.17 per month that the average household is bringing in to support their families. Back in 1913, the dollar to gold ratio was just $29.01, and today one gold dollar is still measured by the same gold dollar value, which was used in 1849 to 1889, weighing in at 1.672 grams or 0.04837 troy ounces. One gold dollar is equal to $91.91. So if gold and silver are the standards for the real tangible money that will never lose its value in contrast to paper fiat money, and if the average family brings in $2,872.17 fiat per month, then in actuality, an average family truly brings in just $31.25 of gold per month. As stated before, if all Americans proceeded to issue demand notes in all areas of commercial transactions with the intent to discharge the debt to stop assuming liability for the use of Federal Reserve notes, the national debt could be eradicated in no time at all. One final thought in relation to the national public debt, which is highly talked about every year, especially in the year 2020, with the widespread of the global economic pandemic known as COVID-19, is that the name of a U.S. citizen, U.S. resident, or legal permanent resident, and his Social Security number, or ITIN, creates the securities needed for the federal government to then package those securities into bonds to be sold around the world to investors. All U.S. citizens have been naturalized via the birth certificate. All birth certificates have a listed registrar or assessor clerk. And according to Title 8 U.S.C. 1101, Section A7, the term clerk of court means the clerk of a naturalization court. As the bonds are sold, the federal government cannot get away with 100% of fraud, earning a profit from the U.S. citizens' labor. Therefore, the government gives a portion of the securities to its citizens on the private side, called a CAFR funds, and given the citizens on the public side via old age insurance, workers' compensation, Social Security insurance, 401k, Medi-Cal, Medicare, and other means of public insurance. Every created security goes into the CAFR accounts in the county and continues to grow. Whenever there's talk about the debt ceiling or debt clock in New York City, it is money, $27 trillion that is owed to the nationals on the private side of the ledger, and $27 trillion of dischargeable debt on the public side. The private side is also inheritance funds that are uncollectible unless the national operates completely in trust in the name of their forefathers and foremothers of the Mohammedan nation, which means the national is descendable, who is able to collect what is rightfully theirs. Only nationals of an express trust, aka natural persons, can own property fully protected by the United States Constitution, Contract Clause, Section 1. The rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights of natural persons only. Artificial entities such as corporations, limited liability companies, and other entities established by the laws of any state, the United States, or any foreign state shall have no rights under this Constitution and are subject to regulation by the people through federal, state, or local law. The privileges of artificial entities shall be determined by the people through federal, state, or local law and shall not be construed to be inherent or inalienable. 116th Congress, First Session, HJ Resolution 48, February 22nd, 2019. All right, everybody. That's the end of chapter 5 right there. I hope everybody got some good information, because I know I did. I got to go back through and highlight some things, make sure I get some stuff all caught up, because I know for people that's sitting there trying to figure out how to eradicate debt, guess what? There you go. You go ahead, take that dollar bill, go to that doggone post office, get you a money order, make it a non-negotiable instrument. There you go, non-negotiable. So that's how we're going to do it in order to eradicate that $27 trillion that they got, calling it public debt. You understand? So everybody that got a credit card, that got a house mortgage, I want you to take, instead of putting it on your credit card bill to pay that note, I want you to do this one time. Go ahead, walk into that post office, get you a money order for that one-time payment. Finish doing the rest of your paperwork like it said, and then send that payment in. And watch your debt erase. Watch it disappear. All right. With that said, I want everybody to understand that I love y'all out there. And I want y'all to get this information so that you can fulfill your destiny. With that being, left palm up, right palm down. Dear Heavenly Father, we ask that you will go ahead and guide us to absorb this information that was given to us so that we can help eradicate the public debt. Because we know that this is how the government holds us into accountability for obligations that we need sometimes. We may even feel like it may be a drastic measure where we are desperate to get something that needs to be done. And so we put ourselves in positions that end up making us a lot worse off than we thought better. It might have been better at that moment because it looked good and it felt good and it sounded good. But then down the road, after you got into it, you realized that, hey, that's not really what I expected. I'm paying more than what it's worth. Well, that's when you go ahead and, as we say, Lord, you give us that knowledge and guidance to go ahead and take care of that transaction in the proper manner. I ask that you will guide everyone's fingertips and their minds to that information to go ahead and get that work done. Guide their legs to walk them through the process, dear Heavenly Father. With that being, I ask that you would touch all our peoples out there so that they will be blessed with this knowledge and health and understanding. One mind, one heart, one soul, one mind, one goal. Amen, amen, and amen. Don't forget, everybody, like, share, and subscribe. If you really appreciate this, don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, one more time, and subscribe. Love y'all. Enjoy your day.